Live now to international affairs commentator Marko Gasic. Marko, thanks for coming onto the programme. Let's start with the Q&A session. What were your biggest takeaways from the President?
Well, I think what I get from the President Putin is a desire for the international system to function as it's supposed to, a desire for dialogue primarily with his American partners, as he calls them, a dialogue for things to function according to the rules of the world order as they've been established for a considerable period. I also detect a slight disappointment that actually a lot of that is not happening precisely because of the attitude of his US partners in Washington, who seem to view agreements between contracting parties as matters of inconvenience to be abandoned as soon as another plan comes along, and who foster instability in the global order as a result. So I detect a slight pessimism about the chances of this thing changing anytime soon, certainly on the basis of the current crises in the world, which mostly seem to be being created by the unwillingness of his American partners to engage in dialogue. It's quite realistic to suppose that instability is the new stability.
Yeah, I mean, if that's the impression that you got, Marko, why do you think that is? Why is there a reluctance for that open dialogue, do you think?
I think because dialogue is one thing, but dialogue is supposed to lead to an agreement, and agreements, as I say, are things where both parties engage in something of mutual advantage. But the USA, really, the Washington deep state to be more particular, doesn't really want consensus. It wants control, not consensus. It doesn't want agreement. It wants obedience from the party it's talking to. So it needs to weaken them first by its policy of sanctions and defamation, threats and so on, and then to hope that by the time they arrive at the negotiating table, they'll be too weak apart from to sign fundamentally what the US wants. But what the US wants is in many cases absolutely unacceptable, as for example we're seeing in the case of Iran, where last year in May the US presented a 12-point ultimatum which resembled the one that began delivered by Austria-Hungary to Serbia which began the First World War, and designed to be unacceptable. The US ultimatum to Iran was pretty much the same thing, though Iran is a slightly bigger player than Serbia was, and therefore war is not necessarily immediately around the corner. Nevertheless, these kind of negotiations, these ultimatums instead of negotiations, are what the US is serving up on the world, and it is a big problem for the world.
If we look at how the international are viewing those Q&As, do you think there'll be much attention even paid to Vladimir Putin's Q&A session, all of what he's had to say?
I think it'll be monitored very closely by those who want to examine exactly what kind of psycho-mental condition he's in, and his energy levels and his non-verbal communications and his implications. Yes, I think it's of great interest to many key departments of power in the West to see exactly how President Putin is functioning at the moment, and how he functions after a long 5-hour session of speaking. So yes, I think it will be of great interest. But I think what should also be of great interest is this sanctions policy that the US seems to be levering against most of the world at the moment. Half the world seems to be in danger of being sanctioned, or is being sanctioned by the US. I think that this will only really end when the rest of the world kind of asks itself, isn't it time for sanctions against this one rogue superpower for breaching all the relevant provisions of the UN Charter regarding the territorial integrity and political independence of other UN member states? We should remember that it was this kind of cavalier behaviour towards the sovereignty of others which led to 2 world wars, and we wouldn't want it to lead to another.
I mean, you know, he said that a stronger response is needed to US sanctions, and spoke a lot about China as well and the trade war. Do you think Russia sees China as the ideal partner to team up against Washington?
I think the Russo-Chinese axis is a partnership of respect and convenience. It's not to say that they don't bargain hard when they're behind closed doors, but they do recognize that they are the biggest chunk of the world, and as long as they stay together, they are safe from the kind of attitude the US would like to implement and has done on other smaller targets. So I think that partnership is here to stay for mutual benefit of both Russia and for China.
Okay, international affairs commentator Marko Gasic. Thanks very much, Marko, for coming onto the programme. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadira.